What is going on, everybody? It's your boy John, and welcome back to Gearbox. So by today's title and thumbnail, y'all already know this is going to probably ruffle some feathers on some folks in the Subaru community. We are officially taking my 2019 WRX off bags and putting it on some Fortunato 8th Gen 500 coilovers. I'm really excited for this. Obviously, because we're filming it, I'm doing it myself. I've never done any suspension work, so this is going to be kind of a learn as you go moment for all of us. I also want to point out, I'm going to be filming this and the uninstall process of the air suspension system simultaneously. So over the next 2 weeks, these videos are going to look the same, but I promise you that they are not, especially toward the tail end of the air suspension uninstall, where you're taking out the wiring harness, so on and so forth. But without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and walk into the garage, and let's take a look at these coilovers. Here they are in all of their glory. Once again, we are dealing with Fortunato 500 8th Gen coilovers. You got your little stamp of approval for the hand assembly there. Got all the hardware in the back, spanner wrenches, etc. So what I'm going to do, I want to start on this side here, move our way here, go over to the driver's side and to the back right there. Shouldn't be too terribly difficult. To my understanding, it's 5 bolts per strut. And then obviously for the air suspension, we gotta deal with that a little bit different than just taking out regular struts or replacing coilovers. But either way, shouldn't be too bad. So without further ado, let's get this car jacked up. Let's get to it. So now that we have the wheel off here, obviously this is going to give us room to work on the actual strut. For the fronts, I think the fronts are just the tiniest bit more involved than the rears. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and we're going to disconnect the ABS sensor. We're going to use a probably, I don't know, 12 mil to disconnect the ABS here. And then really all you have are these 2 bolts right here to disconnect from the brake rotor. And then you go up top and you have your 3 bolts on the top hat. That's really it. Now what we're going to do once we get the airbag off and have the coilover side by side, I want to compare the overall length of the air suspension strut and the coilover strut to make sure my ride height is at least somewhat close to where it should be. It's going to take some adjustment once it's actually on, but the closer we can get, you know, first shot, the better, I guess. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to set y'all down. We're going to take all of this shit off. What I would recommend is take apart the bottom portion first and then do the top hats. That way when you do the bolts here, you can just take the strut out, place it to the side, and you're good to go. So let's get right to it.
Alright, so it looks like the audio for the rest of this video got messed up somehow. I apologize for that. So we're just going to do a voiceover. But basically what I'm looking at here is the actual ABS sensor and the brake line attachment to the air strut. When SD Racing did my air suspension, they were not able to attach that ABS sensor to the strut, so they zip tied it. They did have the OEM mounting location for the brake line, so that's good. But what we want to do is get these 2 things out of the way before removing the 19 mil on the strut assembly to the brake hub, and then we'll move on to the top hat. Should be pretty simple, but that's what's going on here, and we'll move on to the next step. What we're looking at here is now we actually have the air strut unattached from the brake rotor assembly. Pretty simple, 2 19 mils, no big deal. Now what we want to do is actually go up to the top hat. You have 3 12 mil bolts that will need to be loosened. What I would suggest is going ahead and actually loosening them up, but keeping at least one right at the very end, so it's still holding the strut up but not fully loose, and that way when you get back down to the bottom inside the wheel well, you actually have the ability to have one hand on the strut and then unscrewing the last top hat bolt. Now what I'm also explaining here, and this is more for the air suspension uninstall process, but when uninstalling air suspension, you want to keep the entire system pressurized, so we really don't want to disconnect air lines from the air strut. At this point, we're going to install the coilover, leave the air strut hanging down, sitting on the ground, and we will deal with the air suspension side of the process a little bit later. Now we are actually on to the coilover portion of the video. So what we want to do here, first off, is notice that from Fortune Auto, from factory, they will actually set the preload on the springs on the actual coilover, so eliminating a step in the install process. Now from here, what we want to do is really measure the air strut compared to the coilover and determine what the ride height, or at least a general idea of what the ride height is actually going to be. Now at this point, I also really didn't realize if there was a left or a right version of coilovers. I did not understand that coilovers are symmetrical and the camber plates will work themselves out to allow for either a right or left positioning on the car. What we did here, measured from the top hat down to the actual attachments to the brake rotors, wrote it down, and then we mimicked that on the other side when we got to the driver's side, and it's a pretty easy setup, just a step you definitely want to take. So at this point, what we've actually done is, through the coilover in the car, we have hand tightened the top hat bolts, which you are about to see in a second. So that gives it a pretty good mounting point to the top of the car to then work around the attachment to the brake rotor assembly. So what I ended up doing was I actually torqued the top hat bolts to spec, which is 14.5 foot-pounds of torque to each of those bolts. Obviously we measured up against the air strut, which I'm explaining there, but really once you get that top hat mounting location together, really now you're at a point where you can do two things. One, you can start to attach the bottom end of the coilover to the brake rotor assembly, but before you do that, what you're going to want to do is make sure that your lock collar is actually locked down against that bottom portion of the actual coilover. That lock collar requires a spanning wrench, but it also has an Allen key with it, if you can see on the right side of that coilover, to make sure to cinch down and it is not going to move. From there, you can start to attach the camber bolt, so the top bolt, which will go into the coilover, and then the remaining bolt, both 19. Point we have the two 19mm bolts attached. Still need to torque them down, but everything is looking good. Locking collar is locked in place. Just need to torque to spec and replace or reinsert the ABS sensor in the brake line attachment to the coilover, and that's really going to be it for the front side of the coilover install. Now it's time to get on to the fun part of the rear. At this point, we have everything buttoned up on the car. The coilovers are installed on the front passenger side. All I'm pointing out here is if you are uninstalling your airbags, please keep them pressurized. We just pulled them out to the side. We will get to the depressurization in a little bit, but for now they're fine just sitting on the ground, and we will go ahead and move on to
yeah. Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good. Fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts. I pop off when I hear people say I cannot. I get off to the thought of proving everyone wrong. I won't stop to the top, so you better back off and get lost. I'ma stay.
At this point, we have the rear wheel off, ready to install that coilover. What you're going to do is undo these 3 bolts. The 2 front ones closest to us are 17 mil, and the back one going to the sway bar end link is a 14 mil. From there, the top hats are actually in the trunk under the carpeting, so you will have to disassemble some of the trunk, but either way, it's not a big deal. With my air suspension being in the way a little bit, I had to do some let's call it janky workarounds, but either way, not too terrible. So we'll go ahead and start unbuttoning the lower control arm, go up to the top hats, drop it down, and then it should be pretty simple from there. Once you have the lower control arm disconnected from the air strut, you're going to want to go around to the trunk. Like I said, you're going to have to pull some of the interior apart. But as you can see right there, that's where the top hat bolts are. There are 2 of them. What I would recommend is doing as I did, going in and dropping the seats and then going in from the back seat. Just a little bit easier to navigate, and didn't have too much trouble getting those top hat bolts out. And then from there, you'll drop the strut, replace the coilover, and rinse and repeat. Once again, I'm probably repeating myself 1,000 times at this point, but we're going to do the exact same thing we did on the front struts, and that is taking off the air strut, laying the coilover side by side, taking measurements, just trying to get some sort of idea of what this ride height is going to be. What I'm also explaining here is these coilovers have 30-way adjustable dampening. On the fronts, I didn't mess with them because they're easily accessible, but the rears are a little more difficult. So what I'm doing here is twisting all the way to the soft setting and then doing 10 clicks hard, if that makes sense. So just dialing it in a little bit, matching it on either side, and if I need to adjust it later on down the road, I can, but I wanted to set it with the baseline of, let's call it 10 hard for lack of a better term, and that way we have a baseline. We'll install the coilover, and if we need to readjust at a later date, we'll pull the interior back apart, do a twist or 2, and that should be it. Alright, now what I'm explaining here actually might be the hardest part of the install itself, and that is being a solo person doing this job, trying to get the top hat bolts to go through the holes to then be able to screw on a nut in the trunk to at least hold the coilover a little bit while you continue working. The best way I did this, you just kind of poke your head under and you can see the holes pretty easily. Wrap around like I'm doing here and just get one nut on there finger tight. From there, you can get a ratchet, you can torque it down a little bit, and then eventually go back down with a torque wrench to 14.5 pound-feet of torque. But either way, once you get that process, getting the lower control arm buttoned up on the lower half is pretty simple. But I will say that coilover did give me a run for its money trying to get the top hat bolts in place. Now that we have the lower control arm married up to the end link, the brake rotor, and of course the coilover, now it's time to torque everything to spec. So at this point we have torqued the top hat bolts to 14.5 as I mentioned earlier, and then we got to go to the underside. So the first bolt that I'm pointing at there is going to be about 88.5 foot-pounds. The bolt going to the coilover, so that next bolt in is same thing, 88.5 pounds. And then the bolt going through the lower control arm connecting the end link is going to be, I believe it's like 33 foot-pounds of torque. Either way, if you have any questions, drop comments down below or just look at the owner's manual. But a very easy step to ensure a safe ride on your new suspension setup.
All right, y'all, we got a change of clothes. Hands aren't dirty anymore. We got the car all buttoned up. And now it's time to take a look at the final product. I think as far as a first go goes, I think the car looks pretty damn good. There's definitely some adjustment that needs to happen from a ride height perspective. I think overall it's maybe just a tad too low for my liking. But either way, I went ahead and did some measurements, and basically from fender, so right here, all the way to the ground, is right around 2 feet on all 4 corners. So all in all, not bad at all. And really the overall process, not bad at all. As long as you have a couple socket wrenches, probably an impact driver, and you know, some spanning wrenches like they came with in the Fortunato setup. Pretty easy, guys. So I hope you liked the video. I hope it was informative. I am filming this after I already started editing because my camera died and I realized the audio didn't work. It's a whole learning process with this new camera, but I hope the voiceovers worked. I think they did, but I don't know. That's it. But anyway, guys, I hope you liked today's video. Just a reminder, we are going to be doing a part 2 to this video, which is the uninstall process of the air suspension. So obviously, you know, we have the struts out. That's pretty simple. But as far as getting the air tank, compressor management, etc., that's a whole new beast that will be done for another day. I'm going away on a work trip tomorrow, so I won't be back until next week. So hopefully we can film that video next week. But anyway, guys, if you liked the video, please give it a big fat thumbs up. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, please drop them in the comment section down below. And as always, y'all already know it. I don't even have to say it, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell. You know the drill. And until next time, peace.